and we had just talked about an election that took place where General Zachary Taylor, he wins the presidential election, defeating Lewis Cass, and being the war hero that he was, he takes over as president. And at the beginning of his presidency, right at the beginning, gold is found in California at Sutter's Mill. And people from all over Earth, really, begin to flock into California. People from China, South America, Native Americans, free blacks, and then obviously European, Americans coming from the East, coming to California in droves in hopes of what? Get rich quick. That's what they're wanting to do. Okay, and this what this is called, this yearning to become rich quick is called gold fever. Some miners did get rich quick, but the gold fever was often followed by other more deadly fevers like yellow fever and malaria and smallpox and other types of diseases that are just going to naturally occur in areas where lots of people are living together. So the importing overnight of tens of thousands of migrants into California and the Golden State overwhelmed the one-horse government of California, and people resorted a lot to vigilante justice, or where you handle things yourself. You don't call the police, you just take care of it on your own. So there's naturally going to be an outburst of crime, claim jumping, murder. These things, I don't want to say were entirely commonplace, but certainly more frequent than they were in other parts of America. Eventually, though, California drafts its own constitution. And how does California view slavery? For or against? Against. So California, once it would be admitted as a state, would be admitted as a free state. Okay. So, do you think that's going to cause some problems? Yeah. What is the problem? What is a potential problem with California being admitted as a free state? An unbalance in power. So let's look at some of the sectional imbalances that are existing in 1850. 1850 is a pivotal year. It's a pretty important year in American history, okay? Especially when you look at it in terms of North versus South. Some things were really good for the South. The South was prosperous. Cotton prices were high. Plantation owners making lots of money. More cotton plantations were expanding as large plantation owners were overcoming smaller farms and buying them up and planting their lands and buying more slaves. And money was, the South was prosperous. The South had a pretty significant share of the nation's leadership, its fair share. The President of the United States was Zachary Taylor. He was a Virginian born who lived in Louisiana. He's a Southerner. The President's cabinet was obviously going to be a majority of Southerners. The majority of the Supreme Court of the United States, Southerners. And there's even a balance in the states, so that in the Senate, each side would have 30 senators, because each state has 2. So 15 and 15. Now, the admission of California is a concern, because that will upset the delicate equilibrium in the Senate and shift the power toward the free states. The South was also concerned that they had a lack of territory in which they could expand and create new states that could be slave. Some potential areas where slavery could exist would be like New Mexico, Utah, those areas that were recently acquired from Mexico. But those areas do not lend themselves well to growing cotton. You know what state does lend itself well to cotton? California. And it's going to be a free state. Texas was having a land dispute. Texas, when they drew the boundaries of Texas after the Mexican-American War, y'all know what Texas looked like? Look at that. Look how wonky that is. That was Texas. All of it, all the way up to Wyoming, with this panhandle and everything. That was Texas. And Texas claimed it. They said, this is ours. Okay? So Texas was in the midst of a land dispute because parts of Texas extended well above the, almost, up into Wyoming, which is well above the 3630 line. Another concern for the South was the talk that the United States, the capital of the United States, Washington, D.C., was going to abolish the slave trade. The slave trade. Not slavery in the capital, but the slave trade. Now, I'm not talking like for the entire nation. I'm talking about within the city, within the District of Columbia, the buying and selling of flesh would no longer be allowed. The slave trade would come to an end, so no more slave auctions. And then another concern the South had was the principle that their runaway slaves were not being returned once they gained their freedom in the North. So these things that were good, when you weigh them out with their concerns, you can see how the South feels uneasy towards the North, how they're mistrustful, and also all the things that have happened in the past. Okay? Now, when we talk about this loss of runaway slaves, the North, not officially, but unofficially, had a system in place to actually create more runaway slaves and to help runaway slaves be successful in gaining their freedom. And what was that organization called? The Underground Railroad. Now, folks, there are no tunnels under the ground with train tracks. It's not literally a railroad that goes underground. This is just simply what it is referred to. Because a railroad is used to transport things. Underground simply means secretive. Secretive. So it's a secret transportation network. And the whole purpose of the Underground Railroad was to kind of be an informal chain of stops along the way from the south to the north where runaway slaves could be protected, kept safe, and travel inconspicuously until they reached, for some of them, their ultimate goal was Canada, to leave the United States altogether. Now, there were people who helped, and those people were called conductors. They were called conductors, like a train conductor. And the most notable of the train conductors was this woman. Who is this woman? Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman, very good. Harriet Tubman was, an amazing woman. She was illiterate. She never learned to read or write. She herself was a runaway slave from Maryland and was totally fearless. During her time as a slave, she did something that upset her master, and he beat her, and it caused brain damage. So throughout the rest of her life, she had I don't want to call it like narcolepsy, but periods where she would be unconscious and could not be awoken. For the rest of her life, like she would just be normal and fine, and then out. And then she would wake up and be fine. Because she had brain damage. And this woman made 19 trips into the South after she gained her freedom to help runaway slaves, including her parents, whom she helped to emancipate. 19 trips into the South. This is a woman whom at any point could be recaptured and put back into slavery. And she is noted as rescuing more than 300 slaves from bondage, including her elderly parents. She gains a nickname, Moses. Kind of fitting, what did Moses do in the Bible, the Old Testament? Got the Egyptians, or got the Jews out of Egypt because they were slaves. So the South was obviously concerned about the loss of their property. This would be like think of it like this, like an organized system of people who are going around and stealing your car. And they're stealing hundreds, if not thousands of cars all the time. That's how the Southerners viewed it, because they don't see their slaves as people, they see them as property, something they paid for, and once it is gone, it's a loss. It's a loss. It's a loss of income, loss of capital, loss of profit. So the Southerners, they wanted to see laws made by the United States of America that would require anyone who came across a fugitive slave to report it so that they could be returned. Anyone. And anyone who was caught being like an Underground Railroad conductor would face extremely harsh punishment. The South wanted that. So by 1850 we come upon a situation where the North is pursuing something that they want. They want to admit California as a state and it be free. And the South comes upon something that they want. A more strict fugitive slave law. So what typically occurs when two sides that have different agendas want something? A compromise. And who is the great compromiser? Henry Clay. He's still around. Been around since 1800 and something. 1808 or something like that. Still there. 1850, making compromises. So this compromise is more than just, the North wants something and the South wants something. The South was already, in 1850, calling for meetings to talk about secession from the United States. Making their own nation. The South said, we're going to make our own nation. They actually did meet in Nashville, Tennessee. And they talked about considering withdrawing from the United States and creating their own country in 1850. So that is why Henry Clay found it very important to compromise, to come up with something to alleviate these tensions between the two sections. In 1850, Henry Clay was 73 years old. And the great compromiser played a very pivotal role in, smoothing things over in terms of slavery. He'd already done it twice before. So he proposes and skillfully defends a set of compromises which get all lumped together into what we now refer to as the Compromise of 1850. So both North and South are going to have to get behind this. You have some other people who had been influential in American politics since its beginning, like John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun was 68. He was dying of tuberculosis in 1850. Couldn't speak, but he wrote a speech which somebody else read, where he talked about how if the agitation of the subject of slavery is not solved, then the country will end in disunion. Another man, John C. Calhoun dies in 1850, so he's gone. Sorry, John C. Daniel Webster, he was a Whig, one of the founders of the Whigs with Henry Clay, who's also 68 years old, who's aging and ill with liver problems from, high living, that's what we'll call it. And he speaks about the importance of smoothing things over in terms of slavery to keep the Union together. Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, John C. Calhoun, not John C. Calhoun, but Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, they don't like slavery. They don't like it. But you know what they like? even less, what they hate even more than slavery, the idea of the country dissolving, disunion, the idea of a split in our country. They hate that even more. And so they were willing to allow slavery to continue as long as the country doesn't split apart. And that's what is at the heart of the Compromise of 1850. Okay? So let's look at I'm going to tell you the different parts of it. So you can lump this in, call it the Compromise of 1850, because it's like actually 5 different bills, but we put them together. Okay? It's a package deal. Passed, obviously, in September of 1850. And we talked about who brokered it: Henry Clay, Stephen Douglas, a new guy on the horizon who will be important. He's a senator from Illinois. And this is what the Compromise of 1850 does. First, California will be admitted as a free state. So California goes from being part of Mexico in 1848 to an official, full-fledged state in the United States of America in less than 2 years. That's how fast California grew. What caused California to grow so much so fast? Gold rush. All right, so California admitted as a free state. Who's that good for? That is a concession for the North. So you can put a little N beside it for North or whatever. All right. The Texas dispute. See Texas here? That's the Texas of today. It got its look from this as a result of the Missouri Compromise. So the Texas land dispute is settled. New Mexico, technically all of this becomes New Mexico because there's no such thing as Colorado and Kansas at that time. So all of this land is ceded to New Mexico, which was not a state, it was a territory, as you can see here. Okay? So Texas land dispute is solved, and it is surrendered to New Mexico. Who is that in favor of? The North, because Texas was already considered to be a slave state. You are taking territory and population away from a slave state and putting it in a territory. That favors the North. Okay? Another concession to the North. Located right here in between the slave states of Virginia and Maryland is our nation's capital. And the slave trade will be abolished. The slave trade is abolished in Washington, D.C. So there will be a 10 square mile radius in the heart of this slave territory where the slave trade will not be allowed. Is slavery allowed in that territory? Yes. It is still considered slave territory, but the buying and selling of slaves is no longer permitted after this Compromise of 1850 in Washington, D.C. Why? Why would the Northerners push for just the slave trade to be abolished? You think a lot of dignitaries and diplomats come from foreign countries to the United States? Where do you think they go? Washington, D.C. It kind of makes us look bad when one of the first things they see when they arrive is, children being ripped from their mother's arms on a slave auction block. So they disallowed to permit this from happening. So who's that a concession for? The North. They're removing they're putting some restrictions on slavery. So what's the South get out of this? All right, so this new territory that was taken from Mexico is going to be organized into 2 different territories: the New Mexico territory and the Utah territory. Is this red area, are these states? No, it's territory. So that's basically the remainder of the land that we got from Mexico. It's going to be formed into 2 territories, New Mexico and Utah, and The way in which they will determine slavery in these territories is through popular sovereignty. What's popular sovereignty? They're going to have an election, and the people within that given territory will decide for themselves whether slavery will exist or not. All right? How is that a concession for the South? What's the current law on the books in terms of where slavery can expand to? That's right, the Missouri Compromise line, which says anything.
I'm going to take him out to Brendan.
Okay.
I'll leave that door
Okay. Anything north of this line is closed to slavery forever. Well, if you look, this entire territory of Utah Territory is north of this line. So there is potential for slavery to expand north of the 36-degree, 30-minute line. So potential for expansion of slavery. Do you see how that's a Southern concession? Okay. All right, now, Texas, they gave up a good bit of their land with, when they settled the land dispute. Texas gets $10 million for it. That's a Southern concession. Texas will receive $10 million for the land that they gave up. That's another part of the Missouri Compromise. Texas receives $10 million from the federal government as compensation for the land that they ceded to the New Mexico Territory. All right. And the final aspect of the Compromise of 1850, which is definitely the greatest concession the South got, was a more strict fugitive slave law. A more strict fugitive slave law. Okay? A lot of parts to this. California admitted as a state. The rest of the Mexican the rest of the Mexican cession is organized into two territories. Texas is going to lose some land, but they're going to get $10 million for it. The slave trade is outlawed in Washington, D.C., but there's going to be a more fugitive slave law, which we're going to talk about. Okay? So, who got the better deal in the Compromise of 1850, the North or the South? The North. It's pretty clear, really. Clearly the North. What's the biggest concession the North gets? California. When California enters as a free state, it's going to have an enormous population, which is going to seriously tip the balance in the House of Representatives. Plus, the Senate, which was tied, is now going to be in huge favor of, it is now going to be in favor of the North, free states. So not only do they win the Senate, they also win the House. Because it permanently tips the balance against the South. New Mexico and Utah, you don't really think about slavery existing there because, well, what does it look like there? Arizona. This is like present day Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada. It's like a desert. You growing a lot of stuff in a desert? Is slavery going to be essential to the existence of those people there? Not really. No, I'm not saying all of this is just arid, horrible desert that's bad for. I'm not saying that. But large-scale agriculture, not something that's likely to occur there. Okay? So what's the likelihood of these territories being slave? It's not good. That clearly favors the North. All right? So, popular sovereignty, kind of might work in their favor. So, plus the District of Columbia, no more slave trade there. What was the greatest advantage, the greatest of the compromises for the South? Yeah, the drastic new fugitive slave law it becomes known as the Bloodhound Bill. What's a bloodhound do? You guys ever watched an old prison movie? Somebody escapes. They get the bloodhounds out. They track people. Okay, that's what this law becomes known as, the Bloodhound Bill. Now, people in the North hated this. It was very distasteful to them because, the fleeing of slaves could. What it does is, any slave that is captured is not allowed to have any kind of. They're not allowed to testify on their own behalf. Anything they say really doesn't matter. They were denied any kind of trial by a jury, representation. And any northerner who aids in a slave escaping would face heavy fines and jail sentences. You could go to jail for this. In fact, you may even be press ganged into slave catching groups as your punishment. Your job, instead of being put in jail, you'll be put into a group of slave catchers. Okay? So, who loves the Missouri Compromise? Nobody. 'Cause nobody loves it. Everybody, because you have to give up something. It's distasteful to a lot of Northerners because of the fugitive slave law, but it definitely does benefit the North more than the South. This is important for the future. Okay? Does everybody understand the Compromise of 1850? Have I explained it clearly and thoughtfully and well enough to you all? Okay? All right, so here's some articles and political cartoons. These were just published in, these are bills that people would post on the side of buildings and outside. This one's in Boston warning people of color that, if you could be kidnapped just because you are black and taken back to the South as a result. So make sure you have your freedom papers. It's just kind of warning them, warning black people that they could be recaptured and put in slavery, even if they're already free, legitimately. That's one of the things that the fugitive slave law could potentially do. Okay, so pretty distasteful to Northern Americans. Okay, all right. Questions on Compromise of 1850? All right, let's do another presidential election. The election of 1852. The election of 1852. Who won the election of 1848? Zachary Taylor. Why didn't he run in 1852? He's dead. He dies in office only after 16 months as being president. What's he die of?
Is it a disease?
It was cholera. You know where they found him?
Oh, that's great.
On the toilet. Died on the toilet. There's a myth he got it from eating cherries that hadn't been washed. But he got a bacterial infection. His intestines swole, gastroenteritis, bad diarrhea, dehydration, and dies in an embarrassing way. So who takes over? Who was his vice president? Probably never heard his name before. It's not one of those guys. They didn't even choose him. His name was Millard Fillmore. He becomes president of the United States. So, the election of 1852 is really it's the end of the end, really, for the Whigs, for the Whig Party. Okay? So you have two candidates that really come to the forefront. The Democratic choice is a man by the name of Franklin Pierce. A little bit about Franklin Pierce. He's from the hills of New Hampshire. So he does win. We do have a president that came from New Hampshire. Democrats called him the young hickory of the Granite Hills. They're trying to cash in on Andrew Jackson every chance they can. Pierce himself was a weak, indecisive figure. Weak and indecisive. He was a soldier in the Mexican War. He was a general, but he did not really serve with much distinction. He had a groin injury. Okay, like he had a groin injury, and how do you get around in the 1850s? On a horse. Now, if you've ever ridden a horse, you gotta like squeeze the side of the horse. If you have a groin injury, you're not gonna have a lot of strength, and so he fell off his horse once, and he got he did it in front of all his men. He got a bad reputation. They called him the fainting general. And then others claimed that he was an alcoholic. He wasn't really an alcoholic, but he got a reputation because he fell off his horse. Typically, that's if you fall off your horse, that was what the cause was. So, but he was so weak and indecisive, he didn't even rebut or come back with anything good. So, he was enemyless, not really ever been involved in politics, didn't have any enemies. He was a pro-Southern Northerner. He was sympathetic to Southerners. He was a pro-Southern Northerner, so he appeals to both sides. He's from New Hampshire, but he sympathizes with a lot of the things, like the fugitive slave law. He sympathizes with that. He endorses full-heartedly the Compromise of 1850, fugitive slave law and all. So he's just kind of vanilla, blah, just kind of blah. And sometimes blah will win you the election. He runs against the Whig candidate in Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott. The Whigs mess up here by choosing Winfield Scott. The Whigs had some momentum going. Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, they just finished the Compromise of 1850. It's awesome. They did a really good job. They could have boasted that as a great accomplishment. They even already had control of the presidency. They had Millard Fillmore, who was president of the United States. They don't choose him. They could have chosen Daniel Webster or Henry Clay again, but they didn't. They chose another general because that's the luck that they had had in the past, using war heroes as president to run. So they choose Winfield Scott. Anybody know his nickname? All these generals have nicknames. Old Fuss and Feathers. Old Fuss and Feathers. I don't know why these generals get nicknames. I guess their men give them to them. Perhaps Winfield Scott, perhaps one of the most ablest generals in America at that time. He was responsible for conquering really down to Mexico City during the Mexican-American War. And with the slavery issue kind of smoothed over with the Compromise of 1850, the campaign of 1852 turned more to, like it would normally, you would imagine, childish attacks on people's personality. The Whigs tried to paint Franklin Pierce as an alcoholic. One of their slams against him and said, because he was a general, but he wasn't that great of a general. They said he fought many a well-fought battle instead of battle. He fought many a well-fought battle. But Franklin Pierce's campaign slogan is one of my favorite. He's a Democrat. He said, "We poked them in 44, we'll pierce them in 52. James K. Polk. We poked them in 44, we'll pierce them in 52. Isn't that wonderful? So, General Winfield Scott, victorious on the battlefield, gets slaughtered in the ballot box. As the very pliant Franklin Pierce wins a landslide of 254 to 42 in the Electoral College. The popular vote was a little closer than that, but as we all know, the popular vote doesn't mean squat in the presidential election. It's all about the Electoral College. So this election, the election of 1852, basically is the end of the disorganized Whig Party, as their votes are all split between North and South, unable to unify. And within a few years, the Whig Party is completely dead. Doesn't even exist today. But the Whigs' demise brings some worrisome ideas to the national forefront, that political parties will align themselves sectionally, meaning there will be a political party simply for the North and a political party simply for the South. That was a fear. Okay? Questions on this election? Okay, so now, America is kind of halfway getting it together, but they got all this brand new territory out west, New Mexico territory, Utah territory. It's organized. There's troops there. California is a state. It's completely separate, and it's almost like Alaska at this point, way out there. How do you get there easily? If you want to go from New York City to California, what are you going to do?
Take a wagon.
All right, you could take a wagon. Safe? No. Imagine trying to cross the Rocky Mountains in a wagon. No asphalt roads. You're on a mud slick path. You and your horse and your family in a wagon. You guys ready to sign up for that? Oh, by the way, it's October. Almost winter. Better make it quick, or else you might be having a tasty snack you didn't expect. Like your family. Which happened. You ever heard of the Donners? They get stranded in the Rocky Mountains in the winter and they eat each other. That's how they survived. Got to be all out of Pop-Tarts, man. All right. So that's not ideal. How else can you get from New York to California? No trains. A boat. You get on a boat and you just, what do? Just go right down here?
Yeah.
Well, there's something down here you can't really see. It's called Mexico. Yeah. You have to go all the way around the bottom of South America. It's 8,000 miles by a ship. Costly, lengthy, takes a long time. There was no Panama Canal yet. Okay? So, essentially, California might as well be an island 8,000 miles away. It might as well be. And so, America gets the idea that we need to build something. What do they want to build, Brady? A railroad, a train track, okay? Now, is it easy to build a railroad across the entire United States? No. Imagine just trying to build a railroad in West Virginia. Like, we got rolling mountains and stuff, Imagine trying to get a train from one side of the New River Gorge to the other. That's tough. They had to build like thousands of those bridges out in the Rocky Mountains, because the mountains there are much, 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 much taller and much more steep. Well, not as necessarily as steep, but taller. Okay? So, here's the problem. We're going to build it from the north, through the north, or we're going to build it through the south. Oh, man. More problems. If you're from the north, where do you want it built? Hey, look at San Francisco's right here. San Francisco to Chicago. Let's do it. Right there. Boom. Straight shot. People in the south are like, no. We want Southern California. We want to go through. It's much easier to go through here. Before you know it, you're in a state. Texas. Boom. Texas is organized. It's a state. There's government there.
Is Arkansas a state?
Arkansas was not a state yet.
Is Louisiana?
But Louisiana was. Okay? So, transportation problems, are an issue. And before they decided this, one of the things that the government recommended and actually paid for, camels. They brought a bunch of camels from the Near East and brought them to the American Southwest because it's a desert. And they're like, hey, let's use camels. Americans did not take well to the camels. Okay? So it was kind of, they tried to market them as the ships of the desert. That's what they called them. Americans, needless to say, didn't adjust to them. And so a transcontinental railroad was clearly the really only real solution to the problem. It could be done. It's just extremely expensive. Extremely expensive. Hence why they only build one. Not one in the north and one in the south. They just build one. Now today, there's a lot more ways to do it, but the estimated cost was, it's going to take many years to do this. And so determining where the terminus or the stops along the railroad would be was the main issue. Should it be the north or the south? Why was it so important that to the north or the south that they claim that they get this? Oh, everywhere that railroad goes through, the property values are going to skyrocket. Think about it. Is land, like, I want you to think about our interstate highway system. You guys know where Chick-fil-A is on Harper Road? That a pretty valuable piece of property? Yes. You probably couldn't buy that piece of property for less than $5 million. Just the land. No building on, just the land. You buy some land in Coal City? No interstate highway. Is it cheaper in Coal City? Yeah. Imagine if there was an interstate highway that ran right through Coal City and there was an exit. How much the property values would skyrocket. All because of the highway. All right? This is going to do the same thing because those trains are going to stop. And everywhere the train stops is going to be a hub. There's going to be restaurants and hotels and saloons and stuff. There's going to be stuff, a place for people to go to spend money. So it is very important to both sections of the country that they claim the Transcontinental Railroad. But under the Franklin Pierce administration, who is a pro-Southern Northerner, he determines, along with other members of Congress, that it will be a Southern route. Now, in order to accomplish this, the easiest way to do it is to go from the west coast of California through southern Arizona. Now, the problem with this is that we don't own this land. This part of Arizona still belonged to Mexico. When we drew our original boundary line with Mexico, this was not included. So, you want some land that belongs to another country. What do?
Take it.
What do you do first? You ask. So Franklin Pierce arranges to have Secretary of War Jefferson Davis. You ever heard of his name? He's the first president of the Confederacy. But at this time, he was the War Department secretary. And a prominent railroad man from South Carolina named James Gadsden. He commissions to send them to Mexico and talk to the leader of Mexico, Santa Anna, still there, and offer him $10 million for this desert. And that's exactly what this is, guys. This is desert. $10 million. They find Santa Anna in usual need of cash. And the previous couple times they asked Mexico for land, it didn't necessarily end well for them. So what does Santa Anna say? Please take it. Don't hurt me. Give me the money. $10 million. And we purchased this land, this desert land, which is roughly about the size of South Carolina, from Mexico for $10 million. And it's known as the Gadsden Purchase. And it is purchased because we want to build a southern route for the Transcontinental Railroad. And on this piece of land, the mountains are less steep, it's flatter due to the desert, and it's a much more cost-effective way of doing it. If we would have tried to build it through this northern way over the Rocky Mountains, it could have added another $200 million in costs for building bridges and things, and time as well. So we purchased this piece of land for $10 million. So the Gadsden Purchase is important because it enables the South to claim the coveted railroad with even greater insistence. Now they have there's nothing really stopping them. Because all this land now belongs to the United States, the majority of it is organized. California's a state, Texas is a state. This is the New Mexico territory. There's federal troops already there, keeping peace. If there's any Native Americans looking to attack, the troops are there to keep it safe. There's no reason why the South should not be able to build this railroad. Okay? So, Northerners, are they going to accept this though? No, they're not. And they're going to come up with a scheme of their own. And the scheme that the Northerners come up with is called the Kansas-Nebraska Scheme, which eventually becomes known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which we will talk about tomorrow.